They say some stories don't just haunt your dreams, they haunt your silence. When this one ends, listen carefully. Do you hear that? That last whisper in the dark. The fair arrived in the middle of the night. No announcement, no flyers. One day the field by the old highway was empty. The next, it was filled with glowing tents, rusting carnival rides, and the scent of burnt sugar drifting through the air. Blackwood Fair. It hadn't been here in years, maybe longer. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd seen it. But the moment I spotted the towering Ferris wheel blinking in the dark, something pulled at me. A distant childhood memory, half-formed, lingering just out of reach. I went with some friends that night, more out of curiosity than excitement. We were too old for it now, but something about the fair felt different. Not nostalgic. Wrong. From the moment we stepped onto the fairgrounds, the world outside faded. The crowd was thick, but the faces blurred together. The music from the carousel never seemed to end, the organ wheezing out a looping off-key tune. The booths lined the dirt paths in a way that felt off, like pieces of a puzzle forced into the wrong places. And yet, none of it felt as bad as the sideshow tents. I don't know why I walked toward them. My friends had gone ahead, laughing, taking pictures. But I wandered off, drawn past the flashing games and overpriced concessions, into a dimmer, quieter part of the fair. That's where I found it. A small wooden booth, tucked between two darkened tents. The paint was peeling. The glass was smudged with age. A single yellow bulb buzzed overhead, barely lighting the thing inside. A mannequin, at least I thought it was. It stood unnaturally tall, its body thin and stiff in a suit that might have once been black, but had faded into a moth-eaten grey. The fabric stretched over long, wooden limbs, its fingers curled slightly inward, as if waiting. And the face, it wasn't human. Carved from some kind of old, cracked wood, the features almost resembled a man's, but not quite. The smile was too wide, too stretched. The corners of the lips curled so high they nearly touched the cheekbones. Its glass eyes, cloudy with age, looked forward. I read the sign below it. The Grinning Man. Don't laugh. I didn't laugh. I barely breathed. I turned to call for my friends, to show them this thing, but when I looked back, I swear to God, its head had tilted slightly, just enough to face me. I felt my stomach drop. My brain told me it was impossible, that it must have been positioned like that all along, but I knew it hadn't been. I looked around, half expecting someone else to react, but no one did. The moment I rejoined my friends, I felt stupid. They hadn't even noticed I was gone. We went on rides, played rigged games, wasted money on greasy food. I told myself I'd imagined it, but even hours later, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere back in the dark, inside that forgotten booth, something was still watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that grin, too wide, too stretched, burned into the back of my mind like an afterimage. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a cheap, fair property, some carny's idea of a joke. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The yellow glow of the single flickering bulb, the smudged glass, the way its head had moved. I forced myself to roll over, shutting out the thought. At some point, I drifted off. Then, I dreamed. I was back at the fair, but it was different. The laughter was gone. The air smelled damp, heavy, wrong. The booths were dark, the rides still. The Ferris wheel stood in the distance, its gondolas swaying slightly as if something had just moved through them. I turned a corner and saw it. The Grinning Man stood at the end of the path, half hidden in shadow, his frame too tall, his suit too tight on its unnatural limbs. I couldn't see his eyes, only the grin, stretching forever. I tried to back away, but the fairgrounds shifted. One moment I was standing, the next, I was inside the booth, inside the glass case. My breath fogged against the surface. I raised my hands to pound on the glass, but they didn't move. My fingers, wooden, stiff, curled inward. Then the grinning man moved. Not a step, not a twitch, just the barest tilt of his head. The room was dark, too dark. The kind of darkness that makes you feel like the walls are pressing in, like something is sitting just outside your vision, waiting. I reached for my phone. The screen flared to life, nearly blinding me. 3:12 a.m. I let out a breath, shaking my head. Just a dream. A stupid, stress-induced dream. Then my stomach turned to ice. My phone's camera roll was open. I never opened it. And there, at the top of the screen, was a photo I didn't remember taking. A shot of the Grinning Man exhibit. But something was wrong. I tapped the image. The picture was blurry, dimly lit. But the mannequin was there, standing behind the glass, just as I'd seen it earlier. The sign was visible. The flickering bulb overhead caught mid-glow. But the head was facing the camera. I hadn't taken it like that. I knew that for a fact. I stared at the image until my vision swam. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I just didn't remember taking it. Maybe... A notification popped up. I froze. It wasn't a message, not a missed call, just one line of text.
You saw me.
The notification disappeared. No app, no sender, no record of it in my phone. I turned my phone off and shoved it under my pillow, forcing myself not to look around the room. I didn't want to see if something was standing in the dark. The fair was still in town the next day. That shouldn't have been strange, but it was. Blackwood Fair never stayed for long. A weekend maybe, then it vanished overnight. I couldn't even remember it being advertised, just appearing. And now, when I checked the website for the town schedule, there was nothing about it. Like it wasn't supposed to be here at all. I didn't want to go back, but I had to. I needed to see it again, to see if the exhibit was still there. I met up with my friends in the afternoon. They were already planning to go back. Something about getting more fair food, trying to win some rigged game, just acting normal. I kept quiet as we walked past the booths, my eyes scanning the crowd, searching for the sideshow tent where I'd seen it. But when we got there, the Grinning Man booth was gone. Nothing. No faded sign, no peeling paint, no smudged glass. Just empty space between two other attractions, as if there had never been anything there to begin with. I stared at it for too long. "What's up?" Mark nudged me. I opened my mouth, hesitated. There was something here last night. Like what? A sideshow thing, a mannequin. It was called the Grinning Man. Blank looks. Even Ryan, who had walked right past it with me, shrugged. "Don't think I saw that one." "You did," I insisted. "It was here. You walked right past it." Mark smirked. "Man, I think you dreamed that." It wasn't a dream. I knew what I saw. I had proof. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the picture, the one with the exhibit. The mannequin facing the camera. Except, it wasn't there. The image was still on my phone, but the booth was missing. The space where it should have been was just empty fairground dirt, no sign, no flickering light, no grinning mannequin. I stared at it, blood pounding in my ears. No, I remembered how it looked, the faded suit, the carved wooden face, that horrible stretched smile. I hadn't imagined that. But now, even my own photo was trying to tell me otherwise. I barely spoke the rest of the night. I stayed with my friends, pretending to enjoy the fair, pretending not to check over my shoulder every few minutes. The weirdest part, the fairgrounds didn't feel the same. The booths weren't where I remembered them. Some rides looked older, rusted, like they'd been there for decades, but I could have sworn they looked new the night before. I convinced myself it was nothing, but when we passed the haunted house, my stomach turned, because standing at the entrance, just beyond the cracked wooden gates, was a new figure. A mannequin dressed in a tattered black suit. Its head was tilted slightly forward. Its smile was wider than before. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend I hadn't seen that new mannequin standing at the haunted house entrance, dressed in the same tattered suit, its grin wider than before. But that night, I made a mistake. I checked the fair's schedule again, and that's when I realized it wasn't leaving. Blackwood Fair had been in town for too long. A weekend, maybe a few days. That's how long it should have lasted. That's how long it always lasted. But now, it had been a week. I checked the town's online event calendar. Nothing about the fair. No mention of an extended stay, no articles, no posts. No one was talking about it. I scrolled through old posts, looking for anything. Then, buried in an abandoned forum thread, I found a blog post from 5 years ago. The fair was here longer than it should have been. My brother went back the last night it was in town. I never saw him again. I clicked the profile. Deleted. I tried finding more. There wasn't much, just snippets. Strange mentions, half-finished sentences. One user wrote, "It happens in different towns. Always the same rides, same booths. It doesn't leave until it takes someone." Another post, even older, simply said, "If you notice it, it notices you." My mouth went dry. Something was wrong with this place. The next morning I made up my mind. I was going to leave town for a while, clear my head, get away from the fair, the mannequin, the feeling that something was watching me. But when I got in my car and started driving, I ended up back at the fair. I don't know how. I swear I took the highway out of town. I drove for miles, past gas stations, saw the sign for the next town over. But when I pulled over and looked around, I was parked right outside the fairgrounds. The same dirt lot, the same neon glow flickering in the distance. I turned around, drove again, checked every road sign. Every time, I ended up back at the fair. I tried taking side streets, the old farm roads that barely showed up on maps, but somehow, some impossible way, every turn led me right back here. The fair wasn't letting me go. By nightfall, I was panicking. I called Mark, asked him to drive out with me. If I wasn't the only one behind the wheel, maybe I wouldn't end up here. We took his car, got on the highway, made it 5 miles out. Then, somehow, we were back. Mark cursed under his breath. "How the hell?" "I told you," I muttered. We tried 3 more times. Each time, we ended up right back in the same spot, outside the fair. We parked in silence. Neither of us spoke for a while. I could hear the distant wheeze of the carousel organ, the laughter of the crowd. Mark drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. "There's got to be an explanation." "I don't think it's just the fair that won't leave," I said. Mark swallowed. "What do you mean?" I exhaled, barely able to say it out loud. "I think we can't leave either." After the 5th attempt, I gave up. The roads weren't real anymore. Every turn bent me back to the fair like I was caught inside some invisible loop, trapped in a maze I couldn't see. Mark didn't believe it at first. He kept trying, driving further, taking different exits. But it always ended the same. After a while, he stopped talking about it. We both did, because talking about it meant admitting it was real. I started noticing the gaps, not in the sky, not in the roads, in the fair itself. At first, it was small things, booths that weren't in the same place they had been the day before, pathways that seemed longer at night, a funhouse that didn't have an entrance until I walked past it twice. Then, it got worse. One night, I turned a corner near the food stalls, and suddenly I was somewhere else. It was still the fair, but different. The lights were dimmer. The ground was wrong. Not dirt, but something smooth, like the texture of old linoleum. I turned back, retracing my steps. The booths were gone. There were no rides, no people, just empty tents stretching in all directions, lined up like gravestones. I spun around. No music, no sound, no wind, only the fairground lights stretching into the dark. Then, between the tents, something moved. A shape, not human, not a mannequin, something taller. I didn't see its face, just the sliver of a form moving without footsteps, without shifting the ground. I backed away, pulse slamming in my ears. The lights flickered. For a split second, I wasn't alone. The shape was closer. Then, laughter, a burst of carnival noise. I turned a corner and nearly crashed into a crowd, the normal fair, back in place. Everything looked exactly how it had before. I turned back to where I had just been, and the space between the tents was gone, like it had never existed. I didn't tell Mark. He was already acting strange, not scared, tired. I caught him rubbing his eyes too often, blinking like his vision wasn't working right. He kept forgetting words mid-sentence. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he muttered. "Just been waking up weird." "Waking up weird?" He shrugged. "Like I was standing up when I woke up, like I..." He trailed off, frowning. "Like you what?" "Nothing." He forced a grin. "I'm just tired, man. Let's get some food." I let it go. But that night, when I went back to my apartment, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle, just in case. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of the fair. Only this time, when I walked past the sideshow booths, there weren't mannequins inside them. There were people. Their eyes followed me. Their lips curled into strained, unnatural grins. And just before I woke up, one of them blinked. I woke up with laughter in my ears. Not my own. Not from outside. It was coming from inside my head, like an echo of something I couldn't remember. I sat up and checked my phone. 3:12 a.m. The same time I'd woken up before. Something felt off. The room looked normal, but my skin prickled, like something had been watching me before I woke up. I stood and walked to the window. The fairgrounds were visible from my apartment, just beyond the edge of town. Even from this distance, I could see the lights flickering in the dark, pulsing in time with the wheezing carnival music. And in the farthest part of the fair, near the haunted house, a single dark figure stood perfectly still, watching. The next day, I met up with Mark again. He looked worse than before. Dark circles under his eyes, his movements sluggish, like he hadn't really slept. "You look like hell," I muttered. "Thanks," he mumbled. "You ever get that feeling like you woke up, but part of you is still dreaming?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Forget it." We walked through the fair, neither of us really speaking. I couldn't stop looking around, tracking the booths, the way the paths twisted in ways that didn't seem quite right. Then we heard it. A sharp burst of laughter from somewhere nearby. Loud, strange, forced. I turned toward the sound and saw her, a girl standing near one of the booths, gripping her stomach as she laughed so hard her whole body shook. But something was wrong. Her face was frozen in a wide grin, eyes bulging. Her laughter was too high-pitched, unnatural. It didn't sound like joy. It sounded like screaming trapped inside a laugh. People stared, murmuring. Someone reached toward her. "Hey, are you..." She collapsed. I took a step forward, then froze, because behind her, standing just beyond the edge of the fair's flickering lights, was a figure in a tattered black suit. Not a mannequin. Not standing behind glass. The Grinning Man himself. His head tilted slightly, that carved wooden grin stretching impossibly wide. I blinked, and he was gone. The girl was still on the ground. Someone was calling for help. The fairgoers were backing away, but I couldn't move, because just past the girl's body, where the dirt had been undisturbed before, was something new, a set of footprints, leading away. She was gone the next day, not in the way you'd expect. No news reports, no mention of a girl collapsing at the fair. No one even remembered her. Mark barely reacted when I brought it up. "You sure that happened?" He rubbed his face. "I don't know, man. Maybe she just went home." I pulled out my phone, scrolling back through my messages. I had sent a picture of her to myself. Just a quick snap of the scene. The booth was there, the crowd. But she wasn't. The spot where she had collapsed was empty. But right beside it, barely visible in the dirt, was a set of footprints leading into the dark. And at the edge of the image, a glimpse of something tall, watching, smiling. The fair felt different after that night. It wasn't just the way the paths seemed to shift, or the booths appeared in places they hadn't been before. It was the silence between things. A wrong kind of silence, like something was waiting. Mark barely spoke anymore. I noticed the way he stared at nothing, eyes unfocused. How he took longer to answer questions, like his mind was somewhere else. "Have you been sleeping?" I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, I think so." "You think so?" A hesitation. "I've been waking up standing up." That stopped me cold. "What?" Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "Like I'll wake up in my room, but I'll already be on my feet, just standing there. Feels like I was dreaming right before, but I can't remember what about." I stared at him. "That's not normal, man." Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. "None of this is normal." We didn't go to the fair that night, or at least we tried not to. I stayed home, locked my door, sat awake, scrolling through my phone, anything to distract myself. But at some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, I was standing. Not in my room, not anywhere I recognized, just rows of empty stalls, stretching out in every direction, swallowed by flickering lights. The fair. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I turned fast, looking for a way out, but the paths twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Every direction looked identical. Then I saw the booth. Not just any booth. The Grinning Man exhibit. It was back. The glass was clearer now. No smudges, no dust. The yellow bulb overhead buzzed like a heartbeat. And inside, standing in perfect stillness, was the mannequin. Or at least, it had been a mannequin before, because its grin was wider now. Wider than I remembered. And its glass eyes weren't cloudy anymore. They were bright. Watching. I backed away. The bulb flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, it moved. Not much, just the barest shift in posture, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled ever so slightly. The light came back, and it was still again, but its smile looked bigger. I turned and ran. The stalls blurred past me. The laughter of the fair rang in my ears, but it wasn't right. It was too loud, too distorted, like it was coming from everywhere at once. I stumbled, gasping for breath. The lights flickered again, and in the half-second of darkness, I felt it. Something moving behind me. Not running, just following. I woke up in my bed. My room was exactly how I left it. The door was still locked. My phone was on the nightstand. For a split second, I thought I had dreamed it. Then I saw my shoes. They were covered in dirt, fairground dirt, and on the floor, just beneath them, a single footprint that wasn't mine. Mark didn't show up the next day. I called, no answer. By noon, I was at his apartment, knocking on the door. The hallway smelled like dust and old carpet, the air too still, like no one had moved through it in days. I knocked harder. Mark. Silence. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. His apartment was wrong. Not just messy, not just empty. It looked abandoned. His shoes were by the door, but coated in dust. The fridge was open, but there was no food inside. The bed was made too neatly, like it hadn't been slept in at all. But the worst part was the closet. The door was open, just a crack. And inside, I saw his jacket hanging up. The one he wore every day. The one he never went anywhere without. He hadn't left, at least, not in a way that made sense. I swallowed hard and backed away, trying not to look at how the dust in the room was undisturbed, like no one had been moving inside it at all. The air felt wrong, like something had been here, and still was. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Mark standing in his apartment, staring at nothing. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. Then, 3:12 a.m. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I felt it before I saw it, the presence in the room. Not a shadow, not a sound, just the undeniable feeling that something was there. I turned my head, and in the dim glow of the streetlight outside, I saw a shape standing at the foot of my bed. Tall, too still, grinning. I woke up standing, outside. The cold night air bit into my skin. My head spun. I wasn't in my room anymore. I was at the fair. I turned in frantic circles trying to find the path back home, but the layout was wrong again. The stalls loomed closer. The rides stood motionless, towering shapes in the dark. The Ferris wheel creaked without moving. Then I saw the booths, not the rigged games, the sideshow exhibits. Glass cases lined the path, stretching into the distance. Each one held a figure inside. I stepped forward. My pulse pounded. The faces were too human. They weren't mannequins. They weren't dolls. They were people, frozen in place. Their eyes followed me as I passed, their faces locked in grins that didn't reach their eyes. I knew what this was. I knew where I was going, and at the very end of the row, there it was, the Grinning Man exhibit. The light flickered above the glass. The dirt below it was disturbed, like something had been moving in and out of the case. The figure inside wasn't there, because it wasn't inside the case anymore. It was behind me. The air turned ice cold. I felt the presence shift, the awful, stretching smile creeping closer. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The weight of the presence behind me pressed against my spine, thick and unbearable. Like if I moved, if I even breathed too loud, it would take me. I stared straight ahead at the empty exhibit case. The glass reflected the dim, fair lights, distorted and stretched, making the space behind me look like a gaping void. I forced myself to move, one step forward, then another. The presence didn't follow, but I could feel it. Smiling, watching, waiting. The fair was louder than before. The music shrieked from the carousel, twisting into a warped, off-key tune that never stopped. Laughter rang out from every direction, too high, too forced, too wrong. And the people, I hadn't noticed before, but now I did. Their smiles didn't move. They played games, ate food, walked the fairgrounds in lazy circles, but their faces never changed. Grins stretched wide, too wide, their eyes empty as they shuffled between booths like puppets on invisible strings. It wasn't just the sideshow exhibits that held trapped people. The whole fair was full of them. I needed to leave. I had to leave. I forced my way through the crowd, avoiding their frozen expressions, their unblinking stares. I tried retracing my steps, but the layout was different again. No matter where I turned, I ended up back in the same place, in front of the Ferris wheel. It loomed over me, silent and unmoving. The gondolas swayed gently, though there was no wind. The entrance was open. A single ticket lay on the ground, waiting. I didn't want to take it, but something inside me, something not me, did. My hand reached out. My fingers closed around it. The ride operator had no face, no eyes, no nose, just a smooth surface of stretched skin where features should have been. But it was grinning. It took my ticket without speaking, without even moving, and gestured to the only occupied gondola. The doors opened. I stepped inside. The ride started. The fare shrank beneath me as the wheel turned, slow and deliberate, like it wanted me to see everything. I did. I saw the paths shifting when no one was looking. The booths folding into themselves only to reappear somewhere else. I saw figures moving in the spaces between the tents. Tall, thin, grinning. Then the wheel stopped. I was at the top, and directly across from me, inside the gondola opposite mine, Mark. Except, it wasn't him anymore. His face was wrong. His grin stretched unnaturally wide, his eyes blank and unblinking, his head tilted slightly to the side, watching, waiting. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Mark's lips moved. I didn't hear words. I heard laughter. It wasn't coming from his mouth. It was coming from behind me. The gondola rocked slightly, shifting under a new weight. Something was inside with me, breathing, grinning, waiting. The gondola was thick, heavy, wrong, like something had drained all the oxygen out and left only the weight of a presence too close to me. The laughter behind me didn't stop. Slow, hollow, a sound that scraped at my skull like something practicing human emotion but getting it wrong. I squeezed my eyes shut. This isn't happening. This isn't real. Then the gondola tilted. A hand, cold, wooden, settled onto my shoulder, and it whispered, not with a voice, but with something inside my head. It's time. The Ferris wheel lurched downward. I was falling. No, not falling. Being pulled. The fare spun around me in twisted streaks of neon. The laughter grew louder, stretching from every direction, folding in on itself like 1,000 voices laughing at once. Then, silence. The world snapped back into place, and I was standing, not on the Ferris wheel, not anywhere that made sense. I was in the sideshow tent, in front of the Grinning Man's exhibit. Only this time, the glass case wasn't empty. It was open, waiting. The fair was watching me. The crowd wasn't normal anymore. They stood motionless outside the tent, their grins stretched too wide, their eyes following my every move. I turned. My reflection in the glass wasn't mine anymore. It was him, the Grinning Man. His face mimicked mine, stretching wider as I stared. I reached up to touch my face. I couldn't feel my skin, only wood. The truth slammed into me all at once. This was how it happened. This was how it always happened. The fair needed someone new, someone to take his place, and I was next. I fought it. I stumbled back, forcing myself to move, to run, to get out of there. But the fair shifted. The entrance to the tent was gone. The lights flickered, and when they came back, Mark was standing in front of me, or what used to be Mark. His eyes were empty. His grin matched mine now, and when he spoke, it wasn't his voice anymore. I shook my head, panic clawing up my throat. I don't belong here. His grin didn't move. You do now. The lights flickered again. The case was behind me. The laughter started again. 100 voices, 1,000, welcoming me, waiting. The air turned thick. The fair pulled me back, dragging me toward the glass, toward my place in the exhibit. I fought with everything I had. I don't know how I escaped. I remember running. I remember the paths shifting beneath my feet, the Ferris wheel spinning wildly, the sideshow tent vanishing behind me. I remember the laughter chasing me, And then I woke up. In my bed. My door was locked. My phone was on the nightstand. Everything was normal, like none of it had happened. But when I looked at my hands, there were splinters in my skin, and at the foot of my bed, a single fare ticket, waiting.
Still.